Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany and welcome to day 10 of the 12 days of Christmas. So maybe you've noticed, but I really like ranking things. I have several videos where I have ranked short stories in a short story collection, or I did my ranking all of my Switch games, and a video that I do every single year is ranking all the classics that I read for that year. And I have so much fun doing this. So this year I did complete 47 classics. In this list, I am including books that we read for our homeschool. I'm including children's classics, books that I've reread, short stories and novellas if they were separate from a collection. If I just read the one thing and it was part of a collection, still including that in here, but I'm not including any nonfiction. My top books of the year, I never allow myself to include rereads, but I do allow it when I'm ranking classics because I want a chance to be able to talk about them if they ranked highly. I know classics is also kind of a relative term where some people have very specific definitions, but it can be really difficult to find really a definitive definition of what a classic is. So pretty much all of the books on this list are from the 1940s or older. Some of them are much older, and then also there's a couple that were written in the 60s, so some of them are on the newer end that I normally might not consider something written in the 60s like super classic, although when you think about it, that's like 60 years ago, so that was still a while ago. But just so you know kind of like what my working definition of a classic is, it's kind of within that time frame, anything older than that. So that's kind of what we're working with. I am going to mention I had 3 classics that I DNF'd this year, and I just want to mention those really quick because with the exception of one of them, I read hundreds of pages of the other 2, and so I feel like I should get a chance to mention them. I'm also not going to talk in depth about any of these titles because I've talked about them on my channel before, and because there's so many of them, we would be here for forever if I actually talked in depth about any of them. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to kind of share like where it is and like really brief thoughts in terms of like whether or not I liked it, didn't like it, that kind of thing. So the 3 books that I DNF'd, one was Razor's Edge by W. Somerset Maugham. Did not get very far in this one. It was very boring for me. It was about social life in Chicago following World War II, and I just didn't care. I felt like his writing was really dry. I also got 40-something% of the way through Don Quixote. I got like 37% of the way through earlier in the year in May, and then I decided I was going to try to finish it in December, and I just could not get into it trying to pick it up. It had been way too long since I'd read it, and we were getting backstories of people, and I'm like, I don't even remember who these people are. And so this is one that I would like to get back to at some point. The only book that I DNF'd because I was hating it is Gone with the Wind, and I am including this to talk about it because I got 500 pages into this book. 500 pages, which makes me feel like I'm allowed to have an opinion on it because I got so far into it. I think every single character in this book is either annoying or downright despicable, and while I think that the author's writing was beautiful and descriptive and vivid, it actually made me hate the people more. And as I continue to read, I'm like, what is the point of this? Just that people are awful? Because that is the only point I am getting out of this. I just really hated it. I will never pick it up again. I feel like 500 pages was enough, and I will never watch the movie. You can't convince me. Sorry. I know it's beloved, but just was not for me. Okay, diving into the books that I actually read. So, starting off, we are going to say Inspector Cadaver, who I can't even remember who read it. This was on my reader read list. Translated from the French, part of a series about a detective, really weirdly written. And I can't decide if it's the translation, but it was just weird, and the mystery was not mysterious. Number 45, Candide, the last classic that I finished in 2023. Oh my gosh, like I realized what Voltaire was trying to do here and the points that he was trying to make, but I got so tired of like super raunchy things and sexual assault and prostitution being used as a joke and satire to further his point. I was so surprised at how raunchy it was considering it was written, I think, in the 1700s. I was very surprised. I wasn't a fan. I would read more Voltaire, but I would not read Candide again. Next up, also translated, Demian by Hermann Hesse. This book was weird, you guys. This was so weird. And this is higher than Candide, even though I hated the ending more than I hated Candide, because I really liked the beginning of Demian and I really liked his writing style. But it goes really, really deep into like Jungian psychology. And I just, not only do I not know as much about it, but like I'm pretty sure I don't agree with what I know about it. And so I was just like, what are you even doing? Next, we have The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope. This is a classic adventure story with a case of mistaken identity. And I was really bored like the whole time. I read it for my reader read project. I actually did keep this one because I'm like, I could see maybe Claire liking this story at some point, but it just like the characterization was so shallow and I just couldn't make myself care. Next we have The Enchanted April. It pains me that this is in a 2-star spot because so many people say this is a favorite of theirs, and I get why. The writing is beautiful and descriptive, and it's one of those things where if I could live in any place described in literature, the place in Italy described in this book would be somewhere I would want to live. But the people in this book, they're so annoying, and they have this great character growth, but it's like it happens overnight and it's not meaningful, and they're like, it's because of the magic of this place that all of a sudden I'm not a selfish, vapid woman. Now I care about people. And I'm like, what's gonna happen when you leave this place? You've been here for like 2 weeks. I'm pretty sure that you're just gonna revert back to exactly who you were before, which makes this even less meaningful than it already felt. Next up, we have Pere by Honoré de Balzac, and I wish this was higher on this list. There are moments of this book that were really funny, but there are moments of this book that were sad that like weren't supposed to be sad, and I just feel like it's one of those books where it's like the moral of the story, I'm like, is this really what you're trying to say here? Because this is not healthy or good, and why are we celebrating this? It was one of those kind of books. So yeah, I would read more Balzac, but Pere Goriot just wasn't it for me, which is a shame because it was really funny and cleverly written in places, which is why it's higher than some of the other books in this section that I also really didn't like. But oh man, I wish it had been better. I think everything from here on out is 3 stars and up, but we've got a big chunk of books here that were just like meh, they were fine, and so I gave them 3 stars because I'm like, they're not bad, but they're not great. So I have The Secret of the Mansion, which is a Trixie Belden book that I read with Stephanie from Miss Richards Reads, and then we also read The Secret of the Old Clock, which is the first Nancy Drew book. And so we read both of these at the same time because I had so many people tell me like, oh, you loved Nancy Drew as a kid, you should try Trixie Belden. And let me tell you, Trixie Belden as an adult, it's questionable. But so is Nancy Drew. And so it's kind of like, I like Nancy Drew more than I like Trixie Belden, but I think that the writing in Trixie Belden was better, but I just like Nancy Drew more. And I really think that my nostalgia is talking, but I also think that The Secret of the Old Clock is not a good Nancy Drew book. There are better Nancy Drew books out there, and the first one is not that good. And so I think that it would have been a lot better if I had read one of the later ones, but we wanted to read the first book in each series. Next up, we have Scaramouche by Raphael Sabatini. I was bored to tears through most of this book. I liked parts of it. There's parts where the main character ends up with an acting troupe, and so it's split up in part 1, part 2, and part 3. I liked part 2 with the acting troupe and the drama that happens there, but I just like didn't care about the main character, and he felt so insincere to me that when he was championing causes, I'm like, I don't believe you. I didn't care about what happened to him, and then there's this big shocking reveal at the end, and I'm like, I don't care. Next up, we have Robinson Crusoe. I read this with my daughter for school, and she would be appalled to know that it is in the 38th space out of 50 classics. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I did not like this. I thought that, I mean, it was good in places, I'll say that. But I think that it's one of those books, it's not even a long book. I think it's like 300 pages or less. And I'm like, why are you using so many words? I would not have finished it if I was reading it on my own, but my daughter loved it. Next up, we have Cry the Beloved Country by Alan Paton. And this was on my classics TBR for the year because I was trying to read books from all over, and this one is from South Africa, and it is oddly written. Like, the writing style was very off-putting for me. There were moments of brilliance where the writing, I was like, wow, this is really good. And then there were moments where I'm like, what are you even saying? Like, I just felt like it was really weird and inconsistently written. And so that was kind of my issue with it. I loved the ending of it, and I think that the ending redeemed it. Otherwise, I think it would have been lower on this list. Next up, we have The Story of King Arthur and His Knights by Howard Pyle. And I had a lot of fun with this one, reading it with my daughter, but it's not higher up because I felt like it got kind of repetitive at times. And just, I mean, it's one of those things where it's more about like the adventure, and there's not really any characterization or character growth for the most part. And so as a result, it's just kind of like, eh. But like, it was fun, and we have a lot of inside jokes from it. And there were a lot of things about Arthurian mythology, basically, that I didn't know. There was a lot of legend stuff that's normally in things that was new to me, especially when it delved into a lot of King Arthur's knights and kind of like what happened to Merlin at the end. Some of the stories were so interesting to me, and I love them, and some of them I'm like, oh, I have to read another chapter of this today. Kilmeny of the Orchard. Don't I wish this was higher up, because it's Ella Montgomery. This was our group read for Ella Montgomery, and it is my least favorite of hers that I've read so far. I just felt really shallow, felt like it was missing the depth, but it's a book that she had written as a short story, and then she ended up lengthening it for a publication and regretted that and wished she had not done that. And so this was not one of her favorites either, but it just, I don't know. It was not the best. Moments of it, again, were good because I love her writing. So moments were good, but it didn't hold up to most of her other works. Next, we have someone else whose writing I love, but just didn't hold up to some of his other works. And that's Thomas Hardy's Under the Greenwood Tree. I loved kind of the slice of life and the stuff about, you know, the choir and that kind of drama. But the main romance, which was arguably like the main part of the book, especially like the second half of the book, I hated and was just annoyed by. Next, we have Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. This was a fun one that I read with my daughter. Again, this was one of those ones where we delved so deep into like the politics that I felt like we got caught in the weeds with some of the stories. So not really a favorite, but I loved reading it out loud. I loved the beginning and the end especially, and I loved that the Scottish accents were written in. So as I'm trying to sound out the words, I'm inadvertently reading it with a Scottish accent, which I could not actually try to imitate to save my life. Next, we have The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. I actually did a reading vlog of this one, so I'll link that if you want to hear my in-depth thoughts, because oh boy, was this a mixed bag. I loved some of the conversations that he was trying to have. I thought it was really interesting. I liked his writing style overall. I felt like it could have been half the length that it was, and then we get into some really weird sexual stuff of like this boy who's just kind of like has like a sexual awakening in the book, and I just like felt like he was obsessed with that for the second half of the book, and I just got over that real fast. Okay, this is one that I'm not sure really belongs on this list, but it was written previous to some other books on this list, so I decided to include it, but I don't know really if it counts as a classic, and that's The Unexpected Mrs. Polifax by Dorothy Gilman. This is Miss Marple, but make it espionage and make it way funnier. I thought it was charming, funny, really enjoyed it a lot, and you're probably like, why is it like in the middle of your list? Because it has no staying power with me. It didn't impact me, and I'm looking for books most of the time that are gonna leave a lasting impact on me. So this was a great palate cleanser. It was lots of fun, but I don't care if I ever go on in the series. Number 30 was Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. And this is a book that felt really long to me, and I wish that it hadn't, because it's not even that long. It's like 400 pages. But it just felt like it dragged. It felt like it kind of like went in circles and was kind of repetitive. And I don't know. I love Trollope's humor and I love the way that he writes, but I usually don't end up loving his books. There's something that is missing, and I don't know. I've only read Barsetshire Chronicle books by him so far, so I want to read other things from him to see if maybe it's just the series that's not jiving with me or if it's him as a whole. Next we have Jo's Boys, which is the conclusion of kind of like the March family series that starts with Little Women, and it was okay. I felt like we went in too many directions with too many characters, and I just felt like it was kind of all over the place and there wasn't as much that I could latch onto, and I felt like the moralizing was even stronger than Little Men. My least favorite of that series, unfortunately. Next we have Poor Folk by Dostoevsky. This is Dostoevsky's debut novel. It's epistolary, and I think that that's what killed it for me a little bit. I mean, I say killed it. I gave it like 3 stars. I still enjoyed it. I'm still glad I read it, but I just have trouble being connected to characters in epistolary novels, so it just didn't really do it for me, and it didn't have the depth that a lot of his future novels do. Number 27, we have Goodbye, Mr. Chips. This is a story about a teacher and him reflecting on his life as he's coming to the close of his life. I get what the author was trying to do. I think it was good, but not great. Everything from here on out is 4 stars and up. So for number 26, we have Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. This book had issues for sure. For sure. Like, I had so much trouble getting into the first half of this book. I'm like, where are we going with this? And I felt kind of bored with it. But then we hit this pivotal moment, and the second half of this book was drama that I could not stop eating up. I was like, oh my gosh, like this just hit the fan. I had a blast with the second half of the book. Next we have The Shadow Line by Joseph Conrad, and this is really just a coming of age story about learning to be an adult and about a kid who crosses over the shadow line from adolescence into adulthood, and I really liked it. Next, we have the posthumous memoirs of Bras Cubas, which was fun. There's a lot of breaking of the fourth wall. This memoir is, again, posthumous, so it's essentially written by this person's ghost, reflecting on his life. It lacked the emotional punch and depth that I wanted at the end, but there was a lot of great snippets and a lot of fun moments and a lot of humor in it. And it's one that I really want to reread, and one that I really enjoyed a lot and still think about sometimes. Next, we have The Age of Innocence, which I read with my Patreon, my very first Edith Wharton, and I had some issues with this book for sure, but I love Edith Wharton's writing. Oh my word. It was just like, I talked about how I couldn't get through Razor's Edge because it was about socialite life and I was so bored. I feel like so much of The Age of Innocence is about socialite life, but I was glued to the page. I loved her writing so much. I'm going to read another one of her books in a heartbeat just because the writing is so good. Next up, we have A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is about a life in the Gulag. And this book made me think a lot about my own life and reflect and be very grateful. So I really enjoyed this one, and I'm so glad that I read it. Next up, we have Johnny Tremaine, which I read with my daughter for school, and oh my goodness, I loved learning about the Revolutionary War through this book. It's not one that I read as a child. It was one that at first I was just kind of like, oh my gosh, I don't like this, and I think Johnny's annoying, and but his growth over the book is really, really good, and we got very attached to him and other characters in the book, and we really, really loved reading this one in school. Number 20, Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev. This is my first Turgenev, and I really loved it. I read this with a group of people, and I think I was the only one who read it who loved it. Like, I really liked it a lot. I liked his writing style. I liked what he was trying to do with it, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great conversation because I've read other books that were written in response to it, and so it's really fun to read Russian books because they're talking to each other a lot when you get into like Dostoevsky and Turgenev and just like different authors that were writing at the same time. There's a lot of conversation that's happening between their books. And so Turgenev goes a lot into nihilism, and I thought it was really interesting, and I really liked his writing style. Number 19, Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. This book made me laugh out loud so many times. It's so witty, and there's a lot of like kind of, I guess, quips and observations on human nature that are really fun in this. I thought it was a blast. I think Montmorency the dog is my favorite character. Next up, we have The Overcoat by Nikolai Gogol. This is my first Gogol, and apparently Poor Folk by Dostoevsky was written in like a direct response to The Overcoat, and when I found that out, I had to read The Overcoat. And The Overcoat was almost perfect for me. I liked it a lot better than I liked Poor Folk. Had a lot of great humor in it, good reflections on society, which is something that you come to expect with Russian literature, and I had a lot of fun with it. Next up, we have Wise Blood by Flannery O'Connor, which was one of the first books that I finished in the year, definitely the first classic that I finished. And I really enjoyed this book. It was difficult. I say enjoyed. It was difficult, honestly, because it's gritty at times, but Flannery is the best, in my opinion, at examining human nature and hypocrisy and religion and just like looking at those kinds of things. And her perspective is very unique, and her writing to me is very unique and feels very Flannery-esque. There's no one else that feels the same way to me, and I just love her. Next, we have Heart of Darkness. This was my very first Conrad, and then I went on to read The Shadow Line later in the year. I loved this. It's dark and it is unpleasant, and there's definitely some racism and colonization that people take issue with in this book, but I think that Conrad is also taking issue with the racism and the colonization that was happening at the time, which was pretty advanced for a Victorian time period. So I thought it was great. I really liked it. It's one of those books that has so much symbolism and so many different things that you can pull out of it that I can't help but think that I would just benefit even further from a reread of it. Next up, we have As You Like It, which was a Shakespeare play that I read with my daughter. It was her very first like official full Shakespeare play, and we loved it. We have so many inside jokes that we quote from this all the time. We just adored it. Number 14, Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. This was the last of Jane Austen's major novels that I had read when I was younger that I had not yet read as an adult. I read this one in high school, so I remember nothing about it. I loved it. It's not my favorite, and I think that part of that is that I just have a hard time rooting for the main romance, though I just absolutely love the main character. I know lots of people don't like Fanny. I love Fanny. Next, we have Middlemarch. Oh my goodness. Middlemarch, I think, is a masterpiece, honestly. I struggled with it because there are a lot of characters in the town of Middlemarch, and I spent a good chunk of the book confusing several of them. And so I think it's one that upon a reread, I would enjoy more because I'd be able to see more what she's trying to do and intricacies there. But the ending of this book and some of the ending lines in this book are some of the most beautiful and deep things that I've read in any literature ever, and I loved this book. I loved it. Number 12, we have Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Oh my goodness. I love Dickens, period. I just love his writing, and whenever I read a Dickens, it feels like coming home because I grew up reading Charles Dickens. So I really enjoyed Nicholas Nickleby. I loved the storyline, has some of the most just amazing side characters and great Dickens names like Newman Noggs and Wackford Squeers. Just like, I love Dickens names for his characters. So good. Really enjoyed this one. Definitely made me a little teary-eyed in parts, so big fan. Next, we have Oh Pioneers by Willa Cather, and this is my first Willa Cather, and I just jive with her writing style so well. The way that she writes pastoral scenes is perfection to me, and I can't wait to read more of hers. Wasn't a perfect book for me. I had some issues with the ending and things that I felt like were uncharacteristic of people, but I really loved it. We're in the top 10. Number 10 is Something Wicked This Way Comes from Ray Bradbury. It's my first full-length Bradbury novel, so up to that date I had only read his short stories, and oh my word, I loved this book so much. There were things that I didn't love about it, so this was actually not a 5-star book, but I really loved it. It's really stuck with me. I think about it all the time. I really want to reread it, and I need to read more Bradbury soon. Everything from here on out were solid 5-star books, so as you'll notice, I had quite a few 4 stars that just weren't quite perfect. Everything from here on out was 5 stars. Number 9 is the other Bradbury on this list, and it's a short story called There Will Come Soft Rains. And I read this short story individually for a summer book bingo prompt, and I'm so glad that I did. I loved it so much. Bradbury is such a good ideas guy. The way that he explores different ideas, and in this case specifically nature versus technology versus humanity, and do the 3 need each other, and how do the 3 interact, and that's kind of his point with this short story. And he does such a good job of exploring ideas and making you think, and that is why I love him. Number 8 is Labyrinths by Borges. This actually ranked higher in my top books of the year because I was pairing it with Knowledge of the Holy, and I'm not pairing it with anything here. On its own, it's a little bit lower down, I think. But I really enjoyed this. This is, again, something that's very experimental in that it's very, like, idea-based, and it's to make you think. There's not just, like, one conclusion of, like, this is what he's trying to say. It's one of those books you want to read with other people that you can discuss the ideas found there. I am combining into 6 and 7. It's 2 books that are the same, and they're part of a series, and that would be The Saturdays and the 4-Story Mistake by Elizabeth Enright. These middle grade books are a treasure. I can't wait to read the rest of the books in this quartet. The way that Elizabeth Enright writes childhood is so deep and so meaningful, and I love it. Next, we have a reread. Actually, in this top 5, we have 3 rereads. One of those is The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis. Oh my goodness. This was my favorite. I think when I was younger, it was kind of a tie between The Silver Chair and The Magician's Nephew. Those were my 2 favorite stories when I was younger. And I had reread some of the Chronicles of Narnia as an adult, but not this one. And the depth of spiritual truth in this book is so beautiful. It came to me at just the right time, kind of about like Aslan talking and saying like, here's the command, and you need to keep looking at the instructions that I'm giving you. And it was like just such a good reminder to keep your eyes on God's word and that he's with us even when we can't see him and those kinds of things. And it was just like so good. Plus, like, the fantasy world is so interesting and makes me want more of like some of the things that are explored there. And I just think it's brilliant. The plot is so interesting too. I love this one. Next, we have an all-time favorite that I read with my daughter. I had read it previously and read it with her again, and that's The Phantom Tollbooth. And this book is incredible. So much great wordplay and just, oh my goodness, it's so funny at times, but then it makes you think too. We have inside jokes and quote this all the time. It was one of the first books that we read for school in this school year that we're currently in, and she talks all the time and is like, that is my favorite book so far. And so far, the books we've read together, it's mine too. Next, we have Demons by Fyodor Dostoevsky in the top 3, the 3rd spot. I did a dedicated review to this one because I just wanted to talk about all my thoughts on it, so I'll link that video so you can see it. But it actually ended up being like a real page turner in places because there's so much like political intrigue and like you're trying to figure out, there's like mysterious elements to it that is not in other Dostoevskys. There was like an element of fun in reading this one that I didn't have in some of the other Dostoevskys that I've read, and I just loved it. Plus, you know, the themes and the conversation and the depth of philosophy and religious conversation that's happening there was just phenomenal, as always in a Dostoevsky. Number 2 is another reread, and that's The Hobbit. I reread this with my Patreon because we're reading through Lord of the Rings January, February, and March, and so we did The Hobbit in December. It's just as fantastic as I remember. I just love it. It's so cozy and homey, and it is like the perfect December read or winter read because it just feels so cozy and nostalgic, and I loved every second of it. Number 1, you're already gonna know this if you saw my top 12 video. A lot of these upper ones are not a surprise to you, but that's Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. I think Anne might be my favorite Bronte sister. This is my first of hers that I've read, and it just floored me. It wowed me. And when I talked about it in Victober, I had so many people comment on that video and be like, I just bought a copy of Agnes Grey because I need to read it because of the way you talked about it. I'm like, wow, that's how I know I loved it, when I hyped it so well that I like made other people buy it. So for sure, my favorite classic of the whole year. Well, there you go. There are all the classics that I read this year ranked. I don't know if anyone's actually super interested in me ranking all the classics every year, but I have so much fun doing this. And I know that I have some controversial takes on here, and that's okay. We don't have to like the same books. We don't have to like the same classics. It could be that my number one book is like your least favorite book you've ever read, or your favorite classic is one that I just was like not having this year. And that's okay. We can agree to disagree. I feel like in a video like this, I have to give like my more quick takes, and so they might they might be a little meaner than they normally are. And so I'm so sorry if I insulted a book that you really, really love. But I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. Maybe share some of your favorite classics that you've read this year, or if you've read any of the classics on this list and you disagree with me or agree with me, feel free to share that too. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me and the last couple of days of the 12 days of Christmas, and I will see you again tomorrow.